Greetings and welcome once more again. I hope you enjoyed your holiday. I enjoyed mine as well. Today we are back with another topic that you can see Baal of Peor worship before Canaan. And today we are looking at a quite interesting topic which I promised you some time back and I only managed to get time today. And so before we get into our study, we need to understand some different concept or some terminology or some things that we need to go through for us to be able to understand what we are going to study. Right? We are looking at the story of the Israelites, and we understand that as the Israelites left the slavery land, which is Egypt, they faced several trials. And according to Exodus, when we read the book of Exodus, we realize that many of the challenges that the Israelites faced are some of the challenges that God's people are expected to face. Now, we need to understand, as I said before, that we need to understand the Jewish nation of that time who are descendant of Jacob, and also we need to understand the spiritual Israel, that is the modern Israel, that is God's people in our time that are to go through the same experience as the Israelites. And so we are taught by the spirit of prophecy as well as the Bible that their example is for ours to learn and to understand and to bear in mind as a warning for us who are living in this time as we approach the second coming of Christ. Now, to lay the foundation for today's presentation, we need to look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 and 2, where we see God is giving the commandment to the Israelites. And first of all, before he gives the commandment, we are told that he reminded them that he's the God that brought them out of the slavery land, that is from Egypt. And so we see that Israel was held hostage in Egypt, the place that was once an opportunity for them to flourish and to grow and to multiply became the place of slavery. And so we see that as God, plans to deliver them, he reminds them to say, you remember that you were once slave in Egypt, and now you are coming out of that. And so this is another example as we are going to compare the spiritual Israel as well as the literal Israel, that is the Jewish descendant of Abraham, of Jacob. So we are told that the Bible tells us as soon as the Israelites did not accomplish the purpose of which God has called them, God has actually appointed the spiritual Israel. That means those who will have the same characteristics as the Israelites of old. Now we are told, according to Galatians chapter 3, verse 1 to 6 and also 26 to 28, that all those that believes in God of Abraham, they become the children of God. And so we are seeing that, Israel, the literal Israel, the descendant of Jacob, they ceased to be a chosen nation at the time when they stoned Stephen in Acts chapter 6, because their probation time have reached an end. And so from then on, the gospel went to the Gentiles, and that's how the gospel went as far as Rome, and also it came unto Africa. And today you and I are able to experience and understand the goodness of the Lord. And so from then on, this is where Galatians chapter 3, verse 1 to 6, and also Galatians 3, verse 26 to 27 and 28, that we understand that all those that believes in God are called the children of Abraham, not by blood, but by faith which they have in God, the same God that was that called Abraham from his native land, according to Genesis. So we need to compare the characteristics of the spiritual Israel, or the modern people of God in our time that are going to live in these days prior to the second coming of Christ. And also we need to look at the characteristics of the Israel of old and what they experienced before we can understand the last trial which I want to emphasize on, which is Baal of Peor worship. So I'm not going to go through in all the trials that they went through, but I'm just going to focus on that one. But in the meantime, we need to look and compare at the characteristics of these two Israelites, the literal one or the biological one, which are the descendant of Jacob, and also the modern spiritual Israel. Right, first characteristics, for example, in Genesis chapter 17, verse 5, we are told that these are descendants of Abraham. God told Abraham to say, through you I'll bless many nations. So God blessed Abraham, and we know that Abraham had, sons and daughters, but we know that through the son of the promise, which was Isaac, through whom Jacob came through, and Esau. And we know that God chose Jacob to be Israel, sorry, to be the to be the chosen one, and because Esau has actually, you know, chosen his own path against the Lord. And so we see that again in Galatians, as I've said earlier, that God says those who are modern Israel they are descendant of Abraham, not by birth, not by by blood, but by faith which they have with Abraham. So that is Galatians chapter 3, verse 6 to 26 and 28 as well. And we are also told that these Israel of old, they had the commandments of God. Now, according to Genesis chapter 20, we see God giving them the commandments at Mount Sinai. So they are custodians of the commandments of God. The reason why God chose Israel of old among other nations, it was that He wanted to impart knowledge to the Israelites, and therefore they will also share the knowledge of God to the other nations. And through them, the whole earth will come to know the true God, who is the creator of heaven and earth. Now, we are also told in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17, we read that the modern Israel also will have the commandments of God. They will keep the commandment of God, and they have the testimony of Jesus. And this is why the dragon was wrath with the woman. And we have covered this in some other presentation, that the woman signify a church, a pure church is symbolizes a virgin, and the hallowed church as apostate church. So we see that those that keeps the commandment of God, the people of God in the last days, they will also have, or they will keep the commandments of God, according to Revelation chapter 12, verse 17. We are also told in in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 and 2, which I started earlier, that the Israelites of old, the Jewish nation, they were held bondage in the land that was supposed to be of opportunity to them. Now you understand that the history of the Jews, when Jacob went to Egypt, that time when Joseph was a ruler in Egypt, they went there out of free will. And so it was a land of milk and honey for them at that particular time. Until when we read in Exodus chapter 1, starting from 3 to 4, there we are told that after the death of Joseph, there arose another king that made them slave. And so we see that the Jews became slave in a place where they were supposed to be to enjoy life and good time. And so we are also told that the Israel of God, the modern Israel, the spiritual Israel of God, or the people of God who lives on this earth, as they prepare for the second coming of God, that they will be slaves in the territory or in the land that we're supposed to live in prosperity and in harmony. Now, when we read Genesis chapter 3, we understand that things turned up sour, because we know that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, we understand that God created everything perfectly and in harmony, and everything was very good. Until when we reach Genesis chapter 3, then we see that sin entered into the world, and therefore as a result we see our world turned out as it is today. We see death, pain and suffering. And so as a result, we see that human beings have been held hostage or bondage to sin, and as slaves by the devil, who has kept us as slave for quite some time now. And so this is what we are learning from the Israelites of old and the modern Israelite or God's people that will be living in the last days. We are also taught that in Genesis chapter 1, Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, we see that, as I said earlier, that, this is the land that was supposed to be a blessing to them, but instead they became slaves. They no longer enjoy a good life as they used to be. And so we are also told in Genesis chapter 15, verse 7 to 18, that God promised Canaan, or a promised land, to Abraham. So when God came and appeared to Abraham, he said, to your descendant I'll give this promised land to them. So through Abraham, God promised that the descendant of Abraham, that is the Israelite who came through Jacob, they are going to inherit that promised land which Abraham was promised. And so again, we see that God promised a promised land, or Canaan, to all those that look forward to his coming, to his people. In Hebrew chapter 13 verse 14, it says we look forward to that city whose builder, and to that city where our citizenship is, because and that city, the builder and author of it, it is God himself. So we, as we look into the characteristics of this Israelite, we see they have a lot of things in common. We see that they look forward to the promised land, to the Canaan, to New Jerusalem. So we actually see that this is the similarities that we see in both the olden days. So what we see, the olden Jews are actually the type of the modern Israel of God. So we have the type and the antitype in that. And so that means whatever that the Israelites of old have gone through, we need to pay attention to it. Because if we don't, then we are going to be faced with challenges, and we will fall into the same trap as they did. Now Romans chapter 6 verse 16 says, know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servant to obey, his servant ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death, or of obedience unto righteousness. So as soon as God's people are freed, Christ's death allowed us to be freed from sin. Now Christ's death brought hope and a glimpse of assurance to say we can overcome sin. And when Christ died for us, we became freed from slavery of sin and obtained the power to overcome sin, so that we become slave to obedience unto righteousness. Right. So we are told, again, as I've said earlier, that the spirit of prophecy also tells us that we need to pay attention to the trials and the temptations that the Israelites have gone through, and by so doing we can avoid the similar mistakes that they did in laboring against God, and also to overcome those temptations to which they actually fell into. Now this is a Review and Herald, February 18, 1890. It says, the trials of the children of Israel and their attitude just before the first coming of Christ illustrate the position of the people of God in their experience before the second coming of Christ. So their trials and temptations are an illustration of what God's people will go through before the second coming. So whatever that they have gone through, their condition, their spiritual state, we need to pay attention to it. How was it? Were they ready when Christ came, or when he was born in the manger at that time? Were they ready to receive him? Were they ready to welcome him? If the answer is no, then we need to pay attention to that, because we are told their experience will be the same experience before the second coming of Christ. And again, we are taught here that this is Desire of Ages says, the history of the wilderness life of Israel was chronicled for the benefits of Israel of God to the close of time. The record of God's dealing with the wanderers in the desert, in all their marching to and fro, in their exposure to hunger, thirsty, and weariness, and striking manifestation of his power for their relief, is fraught with warning and instruction for his people in all ages. So what we are actually seeing here, what we are actually told here, is that their experience, it is to be our experience, and therefore we need to pay attention to all that, as this will help us to overcome temptation. And if we don't actually pay attention, as I said earlier, then we are likely to commit the same mistakes. And again, we are told in the same book, this is Patriarchs and Prophets 293, paragraph 1. It says, the varied experience of the Hebrew was the school of preparation for their promised home in Canaan. God would have his people in these last days review with humble heart and teachable spirit the trials through which ancient Israel passed, that they may be instructed in their preparation for heavenly Canaan. So we need to review whatever they went through as a preparation for our heavenly Canaan. What they went through, it was preparing them to inherit the earthly Canaan. But the modern Israel, as I've stated earlier, they need to review the experience of Israel of old in order to prepare for the heavenly Canaan. So now let's get back to what I wanted us to look at. Remember, I said I'm not going to cover everything. I'm just going to touch some few things which I think they are vital and are important to our study for today. And so remember, I said that we are not going to cover all of the aspects that we see or what they went through, but rather we are going to only to cover that portion of eminent to entering the promised land. Now, first Corinthians chapter 10 verse 6 to 15, Paul's write and say these things or these stories or this history that is chronicled about the Israelite, they are written for our example, and that we may learn from them, as I said earlier, so that we don't fall prey to what they fell prey in their walk with God as they walked into the wilderness. And so Numbers chapter 25 tells us of a quite interesting story. It is interesting to note that the children of Israel have wandered in the wilderness for nearly almost 40 years, and now they were in the 40th year about preparing to enter the promised land. And so they camped by Shittim. This is what the Bible tells us. They camped by Shittim. And so Moses was still alive, and because he was preparing now to inherit the promised land, and so he had to make some arrangement so that they can cross over and inherit the promised land. But now there is something that lies and awaits the Israelites as they waited to enter the promised land. And we read it in Numbers chapter 25. It says, "And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people unto the sacrifice of their gods. And the people did eat and bow down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baal of Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel." So here we are told that as they abode at Shittim, we are told that Moses was very busy with preparation to inherit the promised land. And so in the meantime, because people, they became idle, they didn't do anything, while the leaders, they were busy doing something, they engaged into whoredom with the women of Moab. Now remember, in my previous presentation I stated that women in prophecy symbolizes a church. A woman, like in singular, represent a church, a pure church, a virgin, right? And a harlot woman represent an apostate church, a church that has turned against the Lord, that have turned the word and the teachings of God, and have in it a mingled of truth and error which comes from the world. And so we are told in Numbers chapter 25 that we see the women as in plural. We see women of Moab coming mingling with Israelites, and we are told that as a result Israel committed whoredom. In other words, we see God is very particular to say they offered sacrifice to Baal of Peor. Now this is when we look at the first few verses, we see that the whoredom or the prostitution that God is talking about his people that they have committed, he is referring to spiritual prostitution, or a condition whereby God's people actually goes and worship other gods. So God referred to his people when, or any other church, when they go and leave the true God and they worship idols and other things, he refers them as prostitution, or they have gone out whoredom. So now we are seeing that God is saying Israelite has committed whoredom with the women of Moab. Now this is plural. We see that this was not just one woman. These were many women that they actually committed, or these women that have actually committed whoredom with Israel. But how did it get to this point? Now we are told that these Israelites, first of all, they allowed the interaction between them and Moab to build to a certain level. They allowed themselves to be enticed, because first they started building a friendship with the women of Moab, just like normal friends, and then there was some relationship that existed until they reached a point where they would now go out and join them in their festivity. So Before they entered Canaan, while Moses was busy, there was actually physical fornication between the Israelites and the Moabite women. And how do I know that there was physical, sexuality or sexual activity that was taking place before they even engage into spiritual fornication or going out and worship other gods? We read in the same chapter, that is Numbers chapter 25, and in verse 6 we are told that now when Moses have come to realize what the Israelites are doing, he actually called for the congregation to weep and mourn because there was plague in Israel, and so God was punishing the Israelites. Now before God goes and punish other people, he first need to cleanse his own house. He need to deal with his own children. You remember even in the book of Ezekiel chapter 9, before the angel goes and start slaying the wicked out there, God said, begin at my own house. So destruction begins at God's own house, to prune and to cleanse all those that have apostatized within the church. This is a warning to God's people who are keeping the commandment, that before God can deal with the world out there, before he can punish the rest of the world, the wicked who have chosen to follow their own path, punishment begins to those who knows well about the truth, who are called by his name, who are called, the commandment keepers. So he begins from there. And so we are seeing in verse 6, it says, and behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now it's quite interesting that when other people were weeping and mourning because of the wickedness that was happening here, we are seeing that this person or this gentleman actually comes boldly in the sight of everybody else. That's how apostates have actually found root in Israel, to an extent that somebody was not ashamed to bring a Midianitish woman into the camp, even though the leader was there, in the presence of the leader. And so we see that this gentleman brings a woman from another tribe, and obviously God has told them they should not mingle with the Canaanite women. And so broad daylight he brings them. So there was physical fornication that started. There was a fornication that was committed before they even reached to a point of now worshiping the gods of these Midianitish women and the Moabite women. So there was that intercourse, that relationship, that built. So you can actually see, we can also expect that of all the sins that will infest the church of God, or that will trouble the modern Israel, it will be on commandment number 7. We know that commandment number 7 speaks about not committing adultery. And if you look closer, we are told from here that before they entered Canaan, there was actually fornication that was committed by the border there, and before they even go and offered sacrifice. So before Israel of old enters the promised land, before God redeemed his people from this earth which has become their slavery, we need to expect that a temptation that the church will have to face God's people is that of commandment number 7. And today, if you are just observant, you realize that most of the powerful preachers, they fell at commandment number 7. They preach so powerful, but when it comes to that area, this is where the devil gets them, and this is where the devil always runs and catch all of God's commandment keeping people. And so we can see that indeed we are following the patterns of the old Israelites, but they still hope for God's people to say, if you and I still wish to stand up and firm in God's word, we can still overcome. If we follow and read the example of Israelite, we might just escape these temptations and overcome them. So by the time when we see now they are actually offering sacrifices, they are bowing down, we are told relationship has already been built. So they have already been coming in secretly into Israel, and they have been they have been having that relationship that they now are trusted by the Israelites. So at the end of the day, this is where we see that, Israelites, were now free to go and worship their gods, because they now knew that you know, they could actually trust these Moabites and go out. And yet, this was not, been known. This was not known to Moses.